Have you ever been afraid that you might never be brave enough to love again? Evelyn, a nurse grieving the loss of her child in a tragic accident, is suddenly assigned to care for a newborn, a baby who, just days earlier, lost his mother during a C-section. When the child's father, a cold, distant millionaire, dropped to his knees and choked out, "Please, help my son eat again," Evelyn could only turn away and walk out the door. But that night, she dreamed of her child. And the next morning, nothing was the same. This is the story of a woman who never chose to be a mother, yet came to be called one, through the quiet language of love. If you're ready, let's begin from the moment her heart remembered how to beat. The room glowed with the pale light of early morning. Not dawn, something lonelier than that. A light adrift, neither warm nor cold, like a breath suspended in space. Everything remained exactly as it had been that morning. The crib stood flush against the wall, the mattress flat, the sheets printed with little pandas, untouched, unwrinkled, as if no small hand had ever reached out. A cream-colored stuffed bear lay on top, tilted to one side, its head bowed slightly. Evelyn hadn't meant to buy it. It appeared at the end of a 14-hour shift on a shelf, near the hospital. She paused only a second, then brought it home, as if her hand had chosen it before her mind had time to object. The bear had never been held, because that night it rained, the roads slick, a car ran the red light. When she woke, she was in the ICU, lights white and cold above her like a dream gone wrong. She couldn't feel anything from the waist down. And a soft voice, trying too hard to be calm, cut through her, like velvet over a blade. "We're very sorry, we couldn't save the baby, but you're still alive." She still sat there, just like that morning, on the edge of the bed by the window, her hand resting on her belly, where the scar still pulled tight, though what ached wasn't muscle, but the hollow beneath. There was no funeral, only a clinical report. Stillbirth due to motor vehicle accident and an emptiness no one dared name. She didn't tell anyone but the head nurse, not her mother, not her friends. She didn't want anyone to offer condolences, because grief can't be shared. Her nurse's uniform hung neatly behind the door, like a chapter not quite closed. She stared at it for 3 weeks, every morning, every night. Today, she stepped toward it, touched the fabric. Soft, cool, but it stung. She dressed slowly, pulled the top down over her body, her hand instinctively pressing the scar where the stitches still throbbed. She closed her eyes, just for a breath, then opened them, then buttoned the last button. The kitchen was cold. She made coffee but didn't drink it. The mug sat on the table, steam rising, then fading, like the part of her life she was leaving behind in that room. The ultrasound was still stuck to the fridge door, from month 6. One corner curled. Evelyn reached out, smoothed it flat, but didn't peel it off. She opened the cupboard. The old nurse's bag was still there, worn brown canvas, frayed straps. Inside, a stethoscope, a small bottle of sanitizer, a shift notebook. The last entry read, "What weeks?" Smaller than expected, but still okay. A breeze stirred the curtain. Evelyn put on her coat, her shoes, opened the door. She didn't look back. The apartment behind her was as quiet as a grave with no stone, only memory still breathing. The elevator doors opened, her reflection in the mirror. Nurse's uniform, familiar. Her face, unfamiliar. The eyes of someone who'd guided hundreds of births, now learning how to breathe again. She didn't flinch, but she didn't recognize herself either. The hospital corridor shone white, the scent of disinfectant, the soft squeak of rubber soles. She didn't greet anyone, and no one greeted her. Glances slipped past her like wind ducking a storm. She stepped up to the assignment board. Jonas Wolfe, 9 months old, NICU. Not her baby's name. But reading it made her heart stutter. She said nothing. Flipped to the next page. Afternoon, staff lounge. A tiny cactus still sat on the window ledge, green, alive. A young nurse had once said, "You're not great with plants, Evelyn, so I picked one that doesn't need much." It was still growing, without much water, without anyone watching, still living, quietly, like her, trying to live on. Evelyn touched a spine. It didn't hurt, it just felt real. Evening. She stood before the mirror. Undressed, placed a hand over her belly, feeling each beat of her heart beneath the scar. One breath, soft, almost a whisper. Tomorrow. Begins again. Screen fades to black. The sound of the hospital monitor, slow, cold, steady. A journey starting from where there was nothing left to hold on to, only a heart relearning how to love through loss. In the early morning, the hospital felt like a weary heart, still beating, still functioning, but its rhythm stuttered, quieter, slower, unsure of itself. Evelyn walked the bright corridor, her shadow stretching long and faint under the overhead. Lights, like an older version of herself, following from behind, silent and unseen. She couldn't remember how many days it had been since she last stepped into the neonatal ICU. The scent of antiseptic, the faint sweetness of baby skin tangled in the chill of air conditioning. Everything was so familiar it almost lulled her back into a former life. Only this time, she carried no child inside her. Room 3 stood slightly ajar. The monitor beeped, steady and slow, as if keeping time for a tiny heart still learning how to exist. Inside, the lighting was low. A man sat beside the incubator, head bowed, unmoving. His hair was disheveled, shirt wrinkled, his face unshaven, eyes red-rimmed and sunken. He didn't look like the CEO of a major healthcare company. He looked like someone who had fallen asleep on a wooden chair in another lifetime. Evelyn stood at the threshold, not stepping in. She watched as his hand rested, lightly on the glass, so gently as if pressing any harder might cause his son to vanish. Inside the incubator, Jonas, 9 months old, slept deeply, the tube rising and falling with each breath. His tiny fists curled inward, as if trying to hold himself together. Graham whispered, not knowing if anyone heard. "Your mother's gone now, but I'm here, son. I'll try." His words fell into the space between them. No echo, no answer, only the soft beep of the machine and the quiet ache of someone trying to stay afloat in silence. Evelyn stepped back. She didn't want to hear more, not out of discomfort, but because in his voice she heard her own. That kind of loss was too familiar. Graham didn't know she was there. He was suspended between two worlds, the wreckage of reality and a memory where his wife still existed. Gentle, always smiling, whispering to Jonas through her growing belly. "Do you like the name Jonas? It means peace, you know." She had said that once when they were picking names, sitting together in a nursery painted soft pastel blue. Peace. He used to believe everything could be calculated. Formulas, systems, outcomes. But her death had short-circuited every algorithm inside him. Evelyn returned to the on-call room and opened her notebook. Her hands flipped through patient files out of habit. The first name, Jonas Wolfe. No notes about the father, but everyone on staff knew Graham Wolfe, CEO of Wolfe MedTech, lost his wife to complications during a C-section. Their son, born prematurely at 34 weeks, Jonas refused the bottle. No one could calm him. He only slept when held, but his father's hands were too big. When he tried to hold him, the baby cried. The shift began. Evelyn masked up, scrubbed, gloved her hands. She entered Jonas's room like crossing a pane of glass, where all sound was muffled, every movement restrained. Graham looked up as the door clicked open. His eyes met hers for a second, then shifted away. No greeting, no words, just a quiet step aside. The practiced retreat of a man who no longer knew how to belong in rooms where life still lingered. Evelyn checked the monitors, the temperature, the infant's pulse. Jonas stirred as she touched his foot. His face scrunched briefly, then his eyes opened, wide, dark, unreadable. They held no joy, no sadness, just something unformed but achingly familiar. The eyes of a child who never got the chance to look at her. She trembled. No one noticed. She inhaled, steadied herself, and kept going. Graham stood nearby, silent. He didn't look at her, but he heard everything. Her careful movements, her quiet skill, the tenderness woven into every motion. Then, barely audible, he murmured. Not to her, not to anyone in particular. "I don't know what to do with him." Evelyn lifted her head. Graham turned away. She said nothing. Didn't ask, because if she spoke now, she too might say something she couldn't take back. The shift ended. Evelyn removed her gloves, washed her hands, left the room. Graham remained, one hand on the glass. It wasn't clear how long he'd been standing that way. He didn't follow her, didn't speak, just stared at Jonas, through the transparent barrier, as if silently apologizing for a loss his child couldn't yet understand. That night, Evelyn came home. She opened the closet and looked at the tiny shirt never worn. She didn't touch it, just stood there, then turned away. Graham sat alone in the ICU, light falling across his unshaven jaw in broken streaks, no longer trying to appear strong. Inside the incubator, Jonas opened his eyes, slowly, not fully awake, not fully dreaming. He didn't yet know where to look. His gaze hovered, uncertain, searching for something, someone, on the other side of the glass. No sound, no cry, just a fragile look, drifting across the silence and landing in the heart of the man who sat there, motionless without needing a single word. The ICU lights never turned off, but they never truly lit the room either. A dim hush clung to everything, like breath held too long. Graham sat slouched in the same chair, his back curved forward, shoulders drooping as if carrying something heavy. Yet, invisible, Jonas lay still in the incubator. He didn't cry, But he didn't sleep deeply either. His tiny body curled inward, the way a seed waits for warmth to coax it open. Only that warmth had never come. Graham stared at him, exhaustion dulling his eyes. In his hands, an old ultrasound photo. Its corners curled, a blurry shape, the baby not yet born. Round head, faint fingers, toes barely formed. In the corner, the label, Baby Wolf. No name yet, not Jonas. Back then, everything was still a promise. Just a few months ago, Lila had been sitting on the balcony in the late afternoon sun, on a wooden chair Graham had assembled himself from IKEA. Her hair danced in the breeze. One hand rested on her belly, the other flipped through a small notebook of baby names. She smiled, soft as light. Jonas. I like that one. It means peace. Graham looked up from his laptop. Did you pick it because of the J thing in your family? Or the meaning? Both, she said, but mostly because I want us to remember, every time we say his name, to live more gently, to keep peace in our hearts. He hadn't responded, not out of disagreement, just in his mind, peace had always felt too abstract, too fragile. He preferred things he could quantify, chart, manage. He had once been the man who could calculate every probability. The optimal time for delivery. The safest nutritional plan for Lila. The exact rate of surgical risk. Everything had been scheduled, like any project he ran. Lila used to laugh at his parenting spreadsheets. You really think you can raise a baby like you're coding a new OS? But the baby arrived early. The day Lila was admitted, Graham had been mid-presentation, pitching a new automated healthcare model to a boardroom full of suits. Her message blinked onto his screen. Baby kicked hard. Might be ready early. A smiley face. A red heart. That was the last message she ever sent. He got to the hospital too late to hold her hand. The operating room doors had already closed. 14 minutes later, Jonas was born. 16 minutes later, Lila was gone. There was no time to process. A nurse placed the baby in an incubator. A doctor said, "We did all we could. We're very sorry." There hadn't even been space for tears. Only a hollow spreading through him, cold and numbing, like ice melting directly into his bloodstream. Since then, Graham hadn't left the hospital. He'd gone from CEO to silent father, hours spent just watching a child who refused the bottle, wouldn't sleep, didn't respond to anyone, except Evelyn. She was the only one Jonas didn't cry with. But she never stayed, and all Graham could do was watch from the other side of the glass. His hand rested there now, against the incubator, trying to reach through, to touch a child he wasn't sure how to hold without breaking. "I'm sorry," he had whispered once. No one had heard, only the steady beep of the machines, the unchanging white light, and the kind of fatigue that stretched so long. It felt like it had no edges. Tonight, he held the ultrasound photo again, ran his thumb gently over the ghostly shape of the baby who had no name. Once. "Jonas," he whispered, "live, please, for your mom, because I don't know what I'll do if you leave too." Evelyn stepped in. She didn't speak. She checked the monitors, placed a warm bottle beside the crib, and sat down, close to Jonas. Not like a nurse. Like someone who had lost something too, and was now trying to learn how to come near again. Graham glanced at her, then at his son. Jonas opened his eyes. For a moment, he didn't cry, didn't smile, just looked. And in that gaze, something hovered. A question, soft and wordless. "Where's my mother?" Graham lowered his head, clutching the ultrasound so tightly the paper wrinkled in his fist. He had never prayed before. But this silence, this long, aching silence, might have been one. So long and still, it felt like maybe heaven was listening. Only, the dim light remained, and 2 quiet breaths beside a child who had no idea what he was missing. The night shift was always the quietest part of the hospital's day, but also the time when the deepest questions came home to roost. No voices, no new emergencies, just soft golden light, the beep of heart monitors and footsteps hushed like breathing. At night, the NICU felt like another world. Everything smaller, lighter, more fragile. One misstep in the rhythm of a machine could stop the whole ward's heart for seconds. Evelyn opened the door and pushed the medical cart gently down. The hall. It was just her now. The others had gone home. The infant assigned to her tonight bore the same name she'd seen for weeks. Jonas Wolfe, the boy who wouldn't feed, who wouldn't sleep, who twisted away from every hand that reached for him. The boy who had lost his mother the day he was born. And Graham, his father, always present but never enough, had crumbled after too many sleepless nights. Evelyn entered the room at 2 a.m. Dim light spilled across the incubator, catching on the damp gold strands of Jonas's hair. He wasn't crying now, but his breath was short, his tiny body curled tight, like a dream trapped without comfort. Graham sat beside the crib, hollow-eyed, his fingers resting lightly against the glass, like someone trying to touch a world he no longer belonged to. When Evelyn approached, he didn't look at her. He simply stood, bowed his head, and left. No words. No need. Fatigue had moved beyond language. Evelyn washed her hands again, the cold water blanching her skin. She put on gloves, then took them off. She stepped to the incubator. Jonas's face was flushed from crying, his breath shallow, eyes closed, forehead creased, tiny fists, grasping at air, searching for something to hold on to. She hesitated. One breath, then leaned in, slid her arms beneath the swaddle, and lifted him. Jonas flinched. He whimpered, the sharp, startled cry of a baby touched by a stranger. But then, something shifted. The moment his cheek rested in the hollow of Evelyn's neck, where pulse and breath met under skin, he fell silent. Evelyn froze. Her arms hadn't even tightened. It wasn't a real embrace. But Jonas was still. She sat down, cradling him gently, shifting into the rhythm of comfort. Her arms curved behind him. Not too tight, just enough, like holding a heart without armor. Jonas curled inward, his knees tucked to his chest, his eyes shut. One breath. Then another. Then another. Sleep came. Evelyn watched him, long and steady. Not as a nurse, not as a mother, just as someone who once knew what it meant to have a life held in her arms, and was now trying to remember, so she wouldn't be afraid to hold again. She couldn't recall the last time she'd held a child. Maybe the final delivery before the accident. Maybe a dream, her son laughing in that soft golden light. Or maybe, not once since the day she lost him. Jonas stirred. One small hand reached out, tugged at the lapel of her blouse, then gripped tight. click. A tiny sound cracked the silence. A button popped loose, dropped to the floor, rolled once, then stopped. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't dare, afraid even a shift of breath would undo what had just begun. A child, for the first time, at peace in her arms. She stayed that way for nearly an hour, her back aching, the scar on her abdomen a slow pulse of memory. But she ignored it. That pain, flesh and bone, was nothing compared to the quiet, fragile current moving between her and the boy asleep against her chest. Outside, the sky was still dark. Graham stood at a distance just beyond the door. He didn't come in. He only watched, like someone stepping out of a dream and realizing it might be real. Evelyn, the quiet woman who lived in her own grief. Jonas, the child who refused to eat, refused to rest. Now, sleeping in her arms. One button undone. One breath, complete in a way it had never been before. Graham pressed a hand to his chest. Not from emotion, but because, for the first time in weeks, he could feel his heartbeat, steady. Evelyn bent down and kissed the crown of Jonas's head. Not a mother's kiss, not a nurse's either, just a touch. To tell herself, you can still love. At 4 a.m., she gently placed him back into the incubator. He frowned, reluctant, then settled, and kept sleeping. Evelyn picked up the fallen button, closed her hand around it. No one spoke. No one needed to, because sometimes a single night is long enough to stitch two broken hearts together again, with nothing more than a quiet, steady hold. Graham didn't know how long he'd been standing outside the ICU door. He only knew that with every passing minute, it felt like his skin was being peeled away, not by a blade, but by the sight inside. His son, once inconsolable in his arms, now sleeping soundly against the chest of a woman who had lost her own child. Evelyn sat motionless, unaware she was being watched. Her arms held the baby not tightly, not loosely, just enough. The kind of hold shaped by someone who had once cradled her own through nights of labor, and never got to do it again. Jonas breathed in quiet, rhythmic waves. His tiny nose fluttered gently. His lips parted in the soft instinct of comfort. His head rested in the hollow of Evelyn's neck, the place every baby seems to know, even if they've never been taught. Graham stood still, not because he was grateful, not because he was moved, but because, for the first time since Lila died, he saw something he couldn't control, yet needed more than anything: peace. The name Jonas, peace, finally fit, cradled by a woman who had once been broken. Evelyn didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew he was there, not from footsteps, not from breath, but from the gaze. A gaze any mother would recognize, even one no longer called mother. When Graham stepped inside, the door made barely a sound, but to Evelyn, it felt like cold air brushing down her spine. She knew something was coming, something unavoidable. "You," his voice caught. For the first time in days, he didn't sound like a man who used to command thousands. He sounded like a father who no longer knew what to do. He swallowed, still staring at Jonas, his child, finally asleep. "I know I shouldn't, but," he faltered, hand gripping the rail of the crib, "please, I'm begging you, help my son. He doesn't have a mother anymore." The words split the air, clean and brutal. He doesn't have a mother anymore. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't wept, but the tremble in each word. It pinned Evelyn still, like a hand closing around her heart. No one had ever said that to her. Not like this. Not with those eyes. And suddenly, it was like a mirror, reflecting her back to herself. She, too, no longer had a child to mother. Jonas stirred slightly in her arms. She didn't move. Every muscle in her body had gone tight. Her throat was desert dry. Graham took another step. He didn't know what he was hoping for, only that if Evelyn walked away now, there would be no one left to ask. She looked at him then, for the first time, not as a nurse, not as a woman who had delivered hundreds of babies, but as someone who had just heard the first sob, not from her child, but from herself. She didn't cry, just exhaled, hard, like someone who'd finally let go of a silence that had lasted too long. Her hand tightened around Jonas once, then she stood, carefully. She laid him in the incubator, hands trembling. Jonas shifted, made a tiny noise, a soft of protest. Evelyn paused, just a moment, then drew her hands away. Graham looked up at her, his mouth moved, to say something, to plead, to explain. But Evelyn had already turned. She walked slowly, not rushing, but without pause. Out of the ICU, the door closed behind her, silent. Graham stood frozen. Inside, the child who needed someone to love him. Outside, the only person who could, was gone. In the hallway, fluorescent lights cast a pale wash over Evelyn's face. She didn't fall. She didn't cry. She stood still, her left hand clenched tight, so tight she didn't notice the crescent marks her nails left in her skin. Someone passed her. Neither spoke. She exhaled, deeply, and walked on, as if to stop now would be to shatter. That night, Jonas didn't sleep again. He cried, not loudly, but with a dry, aching sound, mouth open, throat rasping as if he somehow knew the arms that had held him wouldn't return. If you've ever had to leave before your heart was ready, if you know what it means for a single embrace to change an entire night, then stay with us, to listen, to remember, to believe that sometimes love does find its way back. That night, Evelyn came home in silence, not the kind that could be filled with the hum of a dishwasher or the static murmur of a TV, but a silence thick and slow, like mist settling deep in her chest. She didn't turn on the lights. The door clicked shut behind her, and she stood in the dark for a long while, then slipped off her shoes carelessly, letting them clatter to the floor. A small sound, barely anything, but in that stillness it rang out like something delicate inside her had cracked and fallen. She sat on the edge of the bed, still in her scrubs, the scent of antiseptic clinging to her. Hands resting on her thighs, eyes fixed on the blank white wall. There were no pictures there, no distractions, just one sentence looping endlessly through. Her mind, Graham's voice from earlier. He doesn't have a mother anymore. He hadn't shouted, hadn't begged, hadn't wept. And yet that simple truth, spoken with all the quiet desperation of a father unraveling, had cut through every wall she'd built. No one had called her mother since it happened. She'd never heard her baby cry. Never had the chance to hear Mama, for the first time. But that one sentence from a stranger had undone every stitch she thought had held her grief in place. There was no blood, just something deeper, a guilt with no name, rising sharp and silent. She let herself fall back, her head landing on the pillow. Sleep didn't come from exhaustion, not from escape. It came like a curtain falling, soft, heavy, pulling her into a space without light, without machines, without scars or fear. She found herself standing in a pale, glowing space, not quite morning, not quite dusk, no ceiling, no walls, only a gentle, milky light all around, so warm it made her want to kneel down just to breathe. From a distance, a small figure appeared, walking toward her. Unhurried. Each step its own rhythm, like a song her heart had known long before. She ever heard it? The boy said nothing, but Evelyn knew, without needing to understand, that it was her son. Not an ultrasound shadow, not the child she imagined through long, aching nights. He was here. Real, alive in a way nothing else had ever been. She knelt, didn't speak, just placed a hand to his cheek, and felt a tiny, warm hand reach back, soft and certain, touching hers. In that moment, all the questions dissolved, all the sorrow, the shame, the endless what-ifs. She didn't need to apologize. She didn't need forgiveness. His eyes, whole, calm, unblaming, said everything. He smiled, then turned away. No wave, no goodbye. But Evelyn didn't feel left behind. For the first time since the day she lost him, she didn't feel like a failed mother. When she woke, the sky was still dark. The pillow beneath her was damp. Not from tears in the dream, but from something inside, her quietly untying itself. Light, true. She sat up, left the bed like someone who had survived the night not by sleeping, but by dreaming what she needed in order to keep going. She didn't pack much, just pulled on the same blouse hanging by the door, tied her hair back, slung her bag over her shoulder, every gesture smooth as breath. No effort. No hesitation. On the first bus of the day, cold air leaked through the cracked window. She leaned her head against the glass and let the soft, early light fall across her cheek, and she still felt it, that small hand's touch from the dream, like a streak of sunlight that hadn't yet faded. When she entered the hospital, she didn't turn toward the nurse's station. She walked straight to the NICU, stopping outside Jonas's room. Inside, Graham was asleep, slumped in a chair, head bowed, his shoulders heavy. Jonas lay in the incubator, peaceful, turned slightly to one side. Evelyn didn't knock, didn't call out. She simply placed her hand against the glass, lightly, as if afraid to wake anyone. The morning light spilled through the window, washing over her skin, pale and familiar, like the light in her dream that had told her where to go. She said nothing aloud, but the thought moved through her, gentle and steady, like water finding its path. He doesn't have a mother anymore. But if he needs someone to stay, maybe his mother sent me. That morning, the sky wasn't any more beautiful than the days before, but it wasn't gray either. A kind of weightless light, caught between sun and rain, spread softly across the hospital corridor. Footsteps passed, voices called, wheels turned. Heart. Monitors beeped. Everything was just as it always was. Except for one thing. Evelyn came back. No notice. No request for leave. No message to the head nurse. She wasn't in uniform. just a pale gray cardigan, her face bare of makeup, her hair still marked with sleep. But her steps, they held no hesitation. The receptionist looked up, startled for half. "Ika, second." She didn't speak, didn't ask, didn't stop her. Some people, when they return, need no explanation, because their presence alone makes it easier for others to breathe. Evelyn walked straight to the third floor. The neonatal ICU Hiekaweichius didn't pause, didn't glance sideways. The glass doors came into view, and through them, Graham, in his same seat, hands clasped between his knees. Jonas, small and steady in the incubator, like a flicker of flame shielded through the night. She stood outside the doors for a few seconds, not because she was unsure, but because she needed to breathe. No one was waiting. No one had called her. But the doors opened anyway. With a soft ding, just enough to make Graham lift his head. Their eyes met. He rose quickly, an instinct, like reverence, not fear. Surprise flickered across his face. Not the kind that doubted, but the kind that comes from seeing something you'd quietly hoped for, but didn't dare name. Evelyn didn't explain. She looked at Jonas. He was sleeping. His cheeks moved with each gentle breath. One hand rested on his belly, the other curled around the edge of the blanket. When she stepped closer, he stirred. A soft escaped his throat. Not a cry, but the sound of someone recognizing a presence that felt known. She didn't wait. Washed her hands, dried them. No gloves. No scrubs. She lifted Jonas from the incubator with the ease of someone who'd been doing it all her life. And the boy, who once resisted every touch, let out only a faint breath and burrowed into the hollow of her neck. Graham stood frozen. His hand gripped the edge of the chair, as if to stop himself from stepping forward, from saying something that might shatter what was unfolding. He didn't know what to call this. A miracle? Instinct? A meeting point between wounds? Evelyn sat by the window, where the light touched the fold of her sleeve. She adjusted Jonas gently, pressing the bottle to his lips. At first, he turned away, out of habit, but when she held him a little closer, when her palm moved in soft, familiar circles along his back, like the old women in her childhood used to soothe their grandchildren, Jonas opened his mouth. Once. Then again. And then, as if he had known how all along, he began to drink. No one said a word. The quiet, rhythmic sound of feeding filled the room. Soft, steady, full of life. A young nurse passed by and paused outside the window. She stood still for a moment, hand closing over her chest, then stepped back, not wanting to interrupt. Her eyes said everything that words couldn't. Graham didn't move, but his eyes shimmered. Evelyn didn't look at him. She didn't cry. But when Jonas reached up and wrapped his fingers around hers, she leaned down, pressed her forehead lightly to his. That touch wasn't clinical, wasn't borrowed. It was the touch of someone who had decided to stay. Not out of duty, but out of a love too quiet to name. She didn't speak it aloud, but each breath she took was saying, "I'm here now, and this time, I won't let go." Graham stepped closer, slowly, still unsure if what he was seeing was real. He wanted to ask why she came back, whether she might stay. But he stopped himself. He only whispered, "Thank you." Evelyn looked up at him. Her eyes didn't smile, but they were deep. So deep they seemed to carry the weight of a sky that had finally begun to clear. No one in that room knew what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment it was enough. A child, fed in peace, a woman breathing again, and a father, no longer alone. That morning, the sunlight fell gently through the glass, painting the ICU floor in a warm shade the color of soft baked biscuits. Inside, the room was so still it seemed the only sound left was Jonas's breathing, steady, nestled in Evelyn's. Arms like a small cat finally curled into the place it had always needed. She didn't move, didn't whisper, just held him with the kind of stillness that only comes after loss, as if she had always been there. Only someone had turned off the light in her yesterday, and now someone had quietly lit it again. From the hallway, Graham stood with a hand resting lightly on the glass, his gaze fixed on the child, but really what he was looking at was the woman holding him. There was something in Evelyn that made the world fall quiet. Her posture straight, composed, not dramatic, not mournful. But if you looked close enough, you could see the tremble in her shoulders, like someone relearning how to breathe through a heart that had once split open. Jonas drank slowly, his tiny fingers brushing along the edge of Evelyn's blouse, not gripping, not clutching, just touching, and that was enough. Graham didn't enter right away. He left. When he returned, he held a small cloth bag, not hospital-issued, not corporate, just a plain, earth-toned tote with worn handles and soft corners. Evelyn saw him from a distance but didn't speak. Jonas slept on. Graham sat beside her and held the bag out. Voice low, as if speaking something he still wasn't sure should be said. Lila. My wife. She started knitting a blanket for Jonas, but she didn't get to finish it. Evelyn's eyes dropped. Her hand still cradled the boy's head. She didn't reach for the bag, just stared at it, like it contained something too fragile to touch. Graham opened it, pulled out a half-finished strip of beige yarn. 2 sections were complete, the stitches neat and even. The end trailed off with the needles still threaded, the yarn curling out in soft, unfinished loops, like words that had never been spoken in time. I thought, he began, pausing to run his thumb along the edge. Maybe. If someone finished it, my son might feel like his mother is still here. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full. Evelyn stared at the yarn. Her hand went still but didn't reach out. Graham set the blanket gently on the table between them. Jonas stirred softly, exhaling against her chest. I didn't know who to give it to, he said. But you're the first person who's made him sleep. The first time he fed, the first time he didn't cry, was with you. Evelyn turned to him slowly. Her eyes weren't cold, but they were clear. I'm not replacing anyone. Her voice was quiet, steady, but something in it made Graham pause mid-breath. It wasn't resistance or anger, just a boundary drawn in silence, marked in blood and tears and unnamed ache. She continued, softer now. I'm not the mother he lost. Can't patch together a dream that unraveled in the middle. She looked at the blanket, then back at Jonas. Her hands still cradled him. I'm here, not to heal anyone. I'm here because that child, she looked down, gave me the chance to remember I can still love. Graham bowed his head. His hand rested near the yarn, but he didn't touch it again. The whole room thickened with something unsayable. Not silence, but presence. Evelyn laid Jonas gently back into the incubator. He stirred, but didn't cry. He too rubbed his back, whispered something only he could hear, and turned toward the door. Graham lifted the bag as if to take it back, but she paused. "I'm not replacing anyone," she said again, this time gentler, like late autumn wind brushing past a half-closed window. Then she stepped out. But unlike the last time, she didn't disappear. She was only leaving to catch her breath. Graham watched her go, his fingers closing around the unfinished yarn. A part of him knew Evelyn wouldn't knit that blanket. But another part knew. Since she returned, his son had something Lila always wanted for him, a gentleness that didn't need a name. And the strip of soft, unfinished yarn still lay between them, like a quiet reminder. Some wounds don't need stitching to be warm. That morning, the sky held no brilliance, no heavy clouds, just a pale, suspended light, like breath waiting to steady itself. In the NICU, the curtain had been drawn slightly to the side, letting in a soft glow that fell across a quiet shoulder. Someone, sitting still, not out of weariness but as if she finally knew how to rest. Evelyn had arrived early. No one called her. No assignments were given. She wore the same gray cardigan as the day before, her hair pulled low, her face bare. She didn't look tired nor radiant, just unburdened, as if she'd finally set down a stone she'd been carrying in silence for far too long. Jonas was sleeping. For the first time in weeks, the sleep held. Over 2 hours without stirring. His breathing was steady. His face softened. His fists unclenched, no longer grasping for someone who wasn't there. Evelyn sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the incubator, never touching, but somehow still softening the air around them with each small, steady movement. Graham stood in the doorway. He was used to watching from a distance, not intruding, not asking, but today something in that room made it impossible to look away. Not because of Jonas, because of the woman beside him. When Jonas stirred, his eyelids fluttering, nose scrunching in the reflexive search for presence, Evelyn didn't wait. She didn't glance at the nurses, didn't ask for permission. Her arms moved with quiet confidence, lifting him close, tucking his head into her shoulder. The bottle found its place in her hand like it had always belonged there. This time, Jonas didn't turn away. He opened his mouth and fed. No protest, no tension, no coaxing. Evelyn said nothing, but as his eyelids grew heavy and his breathing slowed, she began to hum. A low, imperfect melody. Not a lullaby in form, but in feeling. It rose and fell like the tide against a shoreline that had always known the rhythm. She had sung it once, nightly, when she lay on her side with a hand over her swelling belly, feeling the kicks of a child she would never meet. The first note was always soft, nearly whispered, and now, between the hush of machines and the hush of healing, her voice slipped in, thin and warm, like steam over winter skin. Jonas drank slower, then stopped. No cries, no furrowed brow. Just sleep, his body slack against her, mouth parted, upper lip still glistening with milk. Graham didn't move. One hand gripped the railing beside him, and then, for a breathless moment, Jonas smiled, a tiny curve of lip. Not reflex, not milk, drunk twitching, but something that hovered between waking and dreaming. A smile. Small. Fleeting, but enough to still time. Graham felt something press against his chest. Not pain, but a kind of fullness. The sensation of seeing, at last, his son not merely survive, but be held, be known, be loved. Evelyn leaned in, her cheek grazing Jonas's forehead. Not a nurse's gesture, not a stand-in's, but something soul-deep, a remnant of herself, offered wordlessly. No tears fell. No one spoke. But for the first time since the beginning, the room held no grief. Evelyn remained a while longer, her hand gently patting Jonas's back. Then, with care, she laid him down again. The blanket tucked high, her palm smoothing the pillow beside his ear, Jonas sighed, shifted slightly, and kept sleeping. Graham stepped closer, pausing just a step away. He looked at his son, then at her. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. One had lost a child, one had lost a wife. Each carrying half of something broken, but together they had made a morning without tears. No one replaced anyone. No one was loved out of duty, just two wounded souls who had, by some quiet mercy, found each other. Not enough to erase the ache, but enough to hold it gently without letting it break them again. Night in the hospital never turned black. It was a kind of warm hush, mixed with a quiet so still it felt like the surface of a lake that had never been stirred. In the NICU, when the babies finally stopped crying, when the machines beeped in unchanging rhythm, that was the calmest time, and the loneliest. Jonas had been asleep since early evening. His tiny hands lay open, fingers relaxed, no longer clenched the way they had been night after night. He slept on his side, forehead resting on a soft pillow, mouth slightly open. A line of milk clung to his upper lip, as if he hadn't quite finished swallowing the gentleness just given. Graham sat beside him in his usual place, the chair near the incubator, back against the wall, fingers laced between his knees, head bowed low. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollow from too many sleepless nights, and still he hadn't let them close. He was used to staying awake, not because he wasn't tired, but because sleep felt like surrender. Every time he closed his eyes, Lila's face returned, the slow dimming of her gaze beneath surgical lights, that soft smile fading beneath the oxygen mask. There are some images no one has to remind you of, scars that live just beneath the skin of memory and ache with the barest touch. For weeks, Graham hadn't left the ICU for more than a few hours. He still went home, but sleep never followed. To sleep was to let go, and he wasn't ready to loosen his hold on the only thing he had left. But the body has limits. And tonight, for the first time, Graham gave in, not intentionally, not with plan. Just one breath, when he heard Jonas's heartbeat steady as ever, when the light above seemed softer than usual, he exhaled, and that one exhale let sleep in. Not deep, not filled with dreams, but real. His body slackened in the chair, head leaning to one side, chin to shoulder, his hands still clasped at his knees. Evelyn saw him as she passed. She'd just changed Jonas's bottle, checked his temperature, and there he was, asleep. For the first time, his hair was tousled, his face stripped of all roles. No longer a CEO, just a father whose exhaustion had finally caught up to him. She stepped closer. Slow, quiet, as if even her presence might break the moment. The room was empty. The light low and golden. Outside, the sound of night shift footsteps moved faintly down the corridor. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. There was something about the way he slept, how his body still leaned slightly toward the incubator, how, even in rest, he seemed to shield Jonas from something unseen. Or maybe it was just the sense that she was looking at someone who had held on so tightly for so long that even in sleep, he didn't know how to let go. She turned to the cabinet, near the bedside, and pulled out a soft cloth, not hospital-issued, but one the nurses passed among themselves on especially cold nights. She folded it twice, then laid it over Graham's shoulders. The gesture was small, but in the quiet of that room, it felt like an embrace. Graham didn't wake, but his body softened. Just, slightly, as if some part of him sensed someone nearby. Not to fix, not to replace. Just to be there and understand. Evelyn stood still, eyes on him, not with pity, not with practiced kindness, but with the gaze of someone who had once collapsed herself, who had once wished, just once, that someone would cover her with a blanket when she no longer had the strength to do it on her own. Behind her, Jonas shifted in his sleep. She turned, smoothed his blanket, tucked the edge near his shoulder. Slow, gentle. Everything moving in a shared breath, where every ache was held without noise. She sat down beside them. Did nothing more. Just sat. Sometimes presence is a kind of action. Sometimes it is enough. Graham slept on, unaware that, for the first time in many nights, someone was watching over his rest, with a folded cloth, a hand that never touched, and a heart that had relearned how to be tender without asking to be named. Some nights, all it takes is a blanket draped over tired shoulders to remind a grieving father he's not alone anymore. And have you ever had someone stay, quietly, when you didn't say a word? If stories like this still stir something soft in you, then stay with us. Because sometimes what breaks us is also what leads us home. That morning, the hospital hallway gleamed with its usual white light. No scent of flowers, no laughter, just the steady rhythm of nurses' steps ticking like clockwork, the squeak of wheels turning on tiled floors, and the low hum of doctors speaking. At the far end of the corridor, Graham sat in the waiting room, the chill of the plastic chair pressed against his back. He wore a pale blue shirt, sleeves still rolled halfway from the night before. In his hands, a paper cup of coffee, long, cold. No steam left, just the heavy scent clinging to his fingers. The door opened softly. Evelyn stepped in. She said nothing, glanced around, took the empty seat next to him, leaving half a chair between them. No greeting, no questions. But not all silences are empty. Some are just waiting for someone brave enough to fill them with something true, not necessarily beautiful. After a long while, Evelyn placed both hands on her lap, fingertips brushing the worn fabric of her blouse. She tilted her head toward the small window at the end of the hallway. No light reached this far. Still, she looked as though remembering something that lived farther than sunlight. "I still remember the first time my belly moved," she said softly. Graham looked up, not startled, just drawn, like someone hearing a note strike the glass inside. Him that hadn't made a sound in years. I was on a night shift, she continued, tired, leaned back in my chair, watching a fetal monitor, and then, just a small flutter, right below the navel. I didn't know if it was a kick or a turn, but I knew it was mine. She didn't smile, didn't falter. Her voice held steady, warm, like someone telling a story that belonged to someone else. Only it didn't. Graham stayed quiet. His grip on the coffee cup tightened slightly. His eyes stayed on her. But he didn't interrupt. I placed my hand on my belly. Waited, she said. And he kicked again, a little stronger, like it was the first time anyone had ever answered me, without using words. She looked down at her own hand, as if the memory still lived in her skin. I didn't know such a small movement could stay with me this long, longer than any dream I had about names, or clothes, or the crib I never got around to buying. Graham didn't speak, but his gaze softened, like someone picking up a signal from a station that had long gone quiet. Evelyn straightened her back, turned a little toward him, not fully but enough for him to feel seen. Jonas, she murmured. When he's on my shoulder or nestled into my neck, his breathing, it's the same, gentle, a little slow, but steady. Graham nodded slowly. He set his coffee cup down on the chair beside him, bowed his head, and said, barely louder than breath, "You know, I never really believed Jonas was real, until I saw him sleeping in your arms." Evelyn didn't respond right away. Her eyes closed for a moment like someone absorbing something too close to look at directly. When she opened them, her voice was unchanged but softer. "I didn't try to make anything happen," she said. "I just let myself be near." Another silence settled, but not a heavy one. More like the quiet that comes at the end of a long day when two people sit beside each other, not needing to speak. Somewhere down the hall, a name was called over the intercom. A baby cried out, sharp, then quiet. Someone rushed past the glass doors, but neither Evelyn nor Graham moved. In that moment, they weren't a man who'd lost his wife or a woman who had lost a child. They were just two people, carrying stories unspoken, and finally, just brave enough to say one true thing on a morning that had promised them nothing. Outside, the clouds began to thin. The light still didn't reach the waiting room, but it refracted off the window, casting a faint stripe of brightness across the floor. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't full, but it was enough to see. Peace doesn't always look like sunshine. Sometimes it's just a story told at the right time. Jonas woke earlier than usual that morning, not crying, just opening his eyes and looking. The slant of dawn light passed through the frosted glass, laying a soft golden band across the blanket covering his small belly, stretching all the way to Evelyn's shoulder. She sat beside the incubator, eyes slightly swollen from lack of sleep, her hand resting gently on the edge of the crib, not touching, but close enough for the child to feel he wasn't alone. She said nothing, only breathed, slowly, as if she herself were being soothed by the warmth of this tiny being. Jonas didn't turn his head, didn't wriggle. He just looked at her, for a long time, as though searching for something in her face, something wordless and waiting. Evelyn leaned in without thinking, and her gaze met his. In that brief moment, something in her chest tightened, not from his cry, not from exhaustion, but because of what was in his eyes. It wasn't a baby's look. It reminded her of someone, unmistakably so. Someone who had once held her hand through the earliest chapters of her life, someone whose round, steady eyes could see through anything. And in that gaze, Evelyn felt a swell of emotion rising like water, quiet, unstoppable. She had seen those eyes before, in the mirror when she was 12, sobbing over a failed test, on her mother's shoulder after a childhood fever, and later in the silent photograph on the altar the day her mother passed from a sudden stroke. Evelyn didn't cry. She stepped back slightly, inhaling deeply, her fingers trembling just enough to notice, by one person alone. Graham stood in the corner of the room, having just entered. He saw her face soften, saw her hand brush Jonas's forehead, then pull away, and he understood, not through logic, not through questions, but in a way that was both blurry and clear, like waking from a dream you didn't realize you were having. He looked at Jonas, who blinked, then turned back toward Evelyn. And Graham saw it too. That look, it wasn't his son's, and it wasn't his late wife's. It belonged to someone else, someone who had once loved Evelyn before she even understood what loss was. No one spoke. Evelyn laid a hand gently over her chest, not pressing, just slowing the beat beneath her ribs. "There are some eyes," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone, "that never go away. They stay, somehow, without asking." Graham didn't nod, didn't answer. He simply exhaled, low and steady. He stepped closer, placing a hand on the edge of the incubator near hers, not touching, but close enough. "Jonas has a remarkable gaze," he said, not to console her, not to fill silence, but as a recognition of something neither of them could explain. Evelyn straightened, closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. She didn't need to say she'd just seen her mother in the eyes of a child, and Graham didn't need to ask. Some truths belong in silence, kept whole by the quiet that holds them. Jonas drifted off again, his tiny hand closing once more around the fabric of Evelyn's blouse, as if it was something he'd always known. She looked at him, then stood, stepping slowly toward the door. Before she left, she turned, not to Graham, but to Jonas. "That boy has light in his eyes," she said softly, "like my mother's, but not only hers, like those who've gone and somehow choose to stay." Graham lowered his gaze, said nothing. Outside, the clouds were beginning to break. Sunlight crept in, gentle, like a hand placed on the shoulder of someone who stopped crying, but hasn't yet found the will to smile. Evelyn walked out, leaving behind a room that still smelled of milk and morning air, filled with steady breath and the eyes of a child who had just been seen. Time passed. Quietly, steadily, Jonas no longer lay in an incubator. Every day he grew a little more, his skin firmer, his cry fuller, his eyes staying open longer. Evelyn still came to the hospital, not on an official schedule, but as part of a quiet rhythm everyone silently accepted. New nurses had begun rotating shifts. The NICU returned to its old cycle, other premature babies, new mothers filled with hope, names written fresh on the board. Jonas was nearly ready to go home. Evelyn knew. All the numbers had stabilized. He fed well. His heart, lungs, digestion, everything responded just as it should. The post-discharge checkups were already scheduled at a pediatric clinic near Graham's home. On Jonas's last day at the hospital, Evelyn entered the room with a slower step than usual. not from fatigue, but because. Her heart wasn't quite ready. Jonas was asleep in his crib, one tiny hand resting near the edge of his blanket, his face so peaceful it made you believe perhaps the world still had something gentle to offer. Graham stood in the corner, not in his usual button-down but in a simple gray turtleneck. He looked at Evelyn like he had something to say, but waited until they were alone before he spoke. "Will you come back to the hospital?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her hands were folding the small shirt Jonas had just outgrown. After a moment, she looked up, her voice quiet, steady. "I don't know yet." Graham stepped closer, stopping at a distance that felt respectful, careful not to press. He laced his fingers together, eyes on the floor, as if weighing every word. "I didn't think I'd be brave enough to say this," he began. "But I need you." Evelyn looked at him. Not surprised, just a little blurred around the edges as if a soft breeze had passed over still grass. "No one can replace Jonas's mother," Graham continued. "And I know you're not meant to. But when you're near, he's calm. He eats, he sleeps. He looks at you like he's known you forever." He paused. "I don't want to hire a nanny. Not because they're not good, but because Jonas needs someone who knows how to hold him without making him wait." The silence that followed was familiar, framed by the steady beep of the heart monitor and the soft flick of a sapodilla leaf drifting past the window. Evelyn finished, folding the shirt. She set it down gently on the table, then turned to him. "I can't promise to stay long, can't promise to do anything remarkable. But if that boy needs an arm to hold him, I'll come. Not for the job, but because I need to be near something that makes me believe again." Graham nodded, no attempt to hide the gratitude in his eyes. "I'll set up a small room at the house," he said. "Nothing fancy, just somewhere you can feel at ease. I won't interfere with how you care for him. I only want you to be yourself." She didn't reply, just brushed a hand gently over Jonas's hair, and for the first time, she didn't leave the hospital like someone just passing through. The next day, Evelyn knocked on the door of number 11 Oak Street, the house where a child had called to her with his eyes, and there a new chapter quietly began. Graham's house caught the winter morning light later than most. The pale sun had only just threaded its way through the bare trees out front when Evelyn stepped into the living room where Jonas was crawling across the soft rug, clutching a small wooden toy car she had once ordered from a handmade shop. He was nearly 14 months now, growing fast, strong, beginning to toddle from chair to chair. And most importantly, he had entered that magical, fragile phase of early language, murmuring the beginnings of words, the soft, broken syllables that meant everything to those who listened. To Graham, each sound felt like a door creaking open into the world of speech, one Lila had once dreamed would begin with the word mama. Evelyn never quite knew what she hoped for on mornings like this. She didn't arrive as a nurse anymore, and wasn't sure she had the right to call herself anything closer. She came because Jonas needed arms to hold him, and because, quietly, she needed something soft to hold on to too. Graham had left early for a meeting that morning. Evelyn stayed behind, just her and Jonas in the living room, where the golden light caught dust in midair and settled on the arm of the chair like a memory that hadn't quite faded. Jonas crawled toward her, then looked up, his eyes wide with discovery, like he'd found treasure. She was sitting on the rug, wiping a small spoon with a cotton cloth. Jonas blinked at her, lips moving. At first, it was just a breath of sound. barely more than a breeze. Evelyn smiled faintly, thinking it was nothing, one of those soft, passing sounds all children made. But then, again, clearer, more deliberate, Jonas looked at her and said, E-V. 2 syllables, broken, fragile, but unmistakably human. Evelyn froze. The spoon slipped from her hand and fell onto the rug without a sound. Jonas moved toward her, arms out, reaching, touching, as if to confirm that the name he'd spoken belonged to someone real. E-V. He said it again, this time with the certainty of someone who'd whispered it many times in his head, waiting for permission to let it out. Evelyn stepped back, not from fear, but from something she wasn't ready to name. The sound didn't hurt, but it pierced. Not Mama, not Auntie, just her name, a name she hadn't heard from a child's mouth since the one she never got to hold. From the balcony, Graham had just returned. He stopped in the doorway, motionless. He had heard it, every syllable. He looked at Evelyn, not questioning, not pressing, only waiting for her to find her breath again. Jonas stood between them, his mouth still open, his eyes bright. He didn't understand the weight of the name he'd just spoken. He only knew he missed her, and finally had the words to say so. Evelyn bent down, slowly. She didn't speak. She laid her hand gently on Jonas's shoulder, soft, steady, without hesitation. She didn't say, "I'm here," or "It's me." Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't need to. A child who calls you by name has already welcomed you into the most tender part of his life. Graham came closer. He placed a hand on Jonas's back, then looked at Evelyn. "Your name," he said quietly, "is the first thing he wanted to keep." Evelyn didn't respond. She just watched Jonas laugh, saying her name again and again, E-E-V, as though it were his favorite game, a song only they shared. And then she whispered, so low only her own heart could hear it, "Thank you for calling me. But I won't answer yet. Not until I know that next time. I won't just hear it with my ears, but with the part of me I once lost." The morning slowed, as if even time in that house had learned how to be quiet. Jonas sat on the rug, sucking his thumb and holding his familiar teddy bear, then looked up at Evelyn, his eyes shining with the kind of trust only a child can give, wordless and whole. Evelyn had just poured boiling water into the thermos when the doorbell rang. A long, deliberate chime, more declaration than request. Not someone knocking to be let in, but someone announcing, "I'm here." She stepped to the door and opened it. There she stood, Graham's mother, tall, composed in an ash-gray coat, her eyes steady like someone who'd walked through many storms and emerged with her discipline untouched. She didn't ask, "Is Graham home?" Nor did she scan Evelyn with suspicion. She simply gave a slight nod. "I'm Graham's mother. I've come to see my grandson." The words didn't tremble, but there was something thin and weightless beneath them, like a note she'd repeated in her mind a dozen times before stepping out of the car that morning. Evelyn invited her in. There was nothing grand about the house, only the warm, plain coziness of a space quietly rebuilt by a young father and a woman who had once lost a child, patched together with bottles, soft cloths, and morning glances that carried more than words ever could. Jonas crawled toward the door. At the sight of a stranger, he stopped, looking up. And the grandmother, seeing her grandson for the first time, nearly 14 months old, paused for a half-second. not in surprise, but because the image, the child, those eyes, looked so much like her daughter, the one she'd lost almost 30 years ago to birth complications. That pain had never been spoken aloud. The funeral was long over. People had moved on. But she hadn't. When her daughter-in-law, Lila, died during an emergency cesarean, the grief had pulled her backward. To that day. She hadn't gone to the hospital, hadn't seen the baby. She'd been afraid, not out of anger, but because she couldn't bear to face another fracture, another loss, even if it belonged to someone else. And so, for more than a year, she'd stayed silent. Until last week, when a woman from her charity circle casually mentioned, "Your grandson is remarkable. Barely 13 months and already calling the name of the woman who cares for him. Something like E.V. A name, not mom, not grandma. A stranger's name. She hadn't slept that night. And this morning, she came. "Who are you?" she asked Evelyn, not unkindly, but with the gravity of someone asking to be told the truth. "A nurse? A babysitter? Or, what exactly is it that you do here?" Evelyn stood straight, offering no defense. "I'm the one who stayed with Jonas when he didn't yet know how to breathe steady. I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm not trying to be his mother. But you're the first person he's called by name," the woman replied, and for the first time her voice wavered. Graham stepped down from the stairs, his gaze resting gently on his mother. "Mom, Evelyn isn't just someone. She saved Jonas, not just his health. You stayed away because you were afraid. I get that. But Jonas kept growing. He needed someone beside him. Not to fill a void, but to keep him from falling into one." She turned to look at her son. A breath left her. Not loud, but visible in the way her shoulders dipped. By then, Jonas had made his way back to Evelyn, reaching out to touch the hem of her shirt. She bent to lift him, not to prove anything, not to claim, just because it was what they did, what they were used to. The woman said nothing more, but at the door, hand on the knob, she paused. "I'll come back," she said, "but next time I want to know if there's anything in this house that still belonged to his mother, or if everything now belongs to someone new." She didn't wait for an answer. The door opened, a draft of wind slipped through, then it shut behind her. Evelyn didn't move. Jonas nuzzled his face into her neck and let out a long yawn. Graham came closer, speaking softly. "My mother doesn't open easily, but if you stay, maybe one day she'll see. No one is truly lost if someone is willing to stay behind." The afternoon sank slowly. The last strands of sunlight left only enough gold to stretch shadows across the floor, not enough to warm the room, which now held the weight of an approaching reckoning. Jonas sat in a corner, fiddling with a small music box Graham had once kept as a keepsake. Evelyn had just folded the last of the fresh laundry. No one spoke, but each chest carried something waiting to rise, to crack the silence open. The doorbell rang. One short chime. Firm. Graham knew who it was. So did Evelyn. He opened the door. His mother stood there, not angry but composed, her gaze stripped of emotion but brimming with resolve. She hadn't come for empathy. She'd come to deliver a verdict, a final word. "I want to talk. Clearly. For the last time." Evelyn stood near the window, unmoving. Graham didn't step aside. "No need for privacy," he said. "If you're here to talk about Evelyn, then she deserves to hear it." His mother glanced around the room, the home she'd once imagined her son would share with his wife. Now it was filled with toys arranged by someone else, burp cloths drying in the light, and a child who had spoken the name of a woman not his mother. "I've stayed silent long enough," she began, voice level, cold. "When Lila died, I respected your space. When your son was born, I let you figure it out, but not anymore." She turned to Evelyn, unflinching now. "I cannot accept that a stranger, no blood, no name, no tie, gets to be the mother of a wolf child." Evelyn didn't move, but Graham's fists clenched. "Stop, Mom." "No. You need to hear this. You're vulnerable, Graham. You're letting your emotions lead. She came when you lost your wife, when your son wouldn't stop crying. You've mistaken need for love." Evelyn bit her lip. Her hands trembled slightly, but she didn't back away. His mother went on, her voice rising. Not a shout, but sharp, deliberate. "I can hire someone. I can bring him to my home. I have the means. I have the experience. And her? Who is she? A nurse, shattered by grief, clinging to my grandson like he's some balm for her own old wound." The air tightened. Graham felt the blow like a blade to the chest. Evelyn didn't flinch, didn't cry, but her eyes held a quiet storm. Vast. "And still," Graham's voice broke through. "Enough, Mom. You can be angry, but remember, Jonas is my grandson. He needs to be raised in a stable home, not by a broken woman trying to bury her pain inside a child who isn't hers." That was when Graham stepped forward, standing squarely between his mother and Evelyn. "Fine. Then choose blood. I choose the one who loves Jonas with her whole heart. I choose Evelyn." A silence thickened. His mother froze. "You're choosing a stranger over your own mother." Graham looked straight at her, for the first time without lowering his eyes. "She's not a stranger. She held my son when he refused to eat. She stayed when I was too scared to. She's the reason he finally fell asleep without crying. So you tell me, who holds more claim? The one who gave him life, or the one who stayed?" His mother's jaw tightened. She said nothing. And just then, Jonas wobbled his way toward them. No one called, no one pointed. He crawled on his own, stopping between Evelyn and Graham. He looked up, then lifted his arms and wrapped them around Evelyn's legs. That broke her. She knelt and gathered him into her arms. Jonas clung to her neck, not because he was hungry, not because he was tired, but because he'd felt something in the air, some tremor in the wind that passed through grown-ups who still didn't know what to call love without blood. Graham's mother stepped back. Her gaze wavered, not angry, not shattered, just a woman who had once lost a child, now facing the one thing she could not control, a love that needed no lineage. She left without a word. Didn't slam the door, just walked out, leaving behind a hush that drifted down the hallway like dust. In the living room, Jonas burrowed deeper into Evelyn's arms. Graham sat beside them, his hand resting on her shoulder. No apologies. No promises. Just, finally, someone willing to say aloud, "I choose her." Some conversations aren't meant to convince, but to see who will stand still when love no longer comes with a name. And you? Have you ever been chosen? Not by blood, but by someone who stayed when it mattered most? If this story made you pause for just a moment, stay with it. Because the next chapter begins when Evelyn chooses to answer, Not with tears, but with a line no one saw coming. The morning was bleak. No sun, no rain, just a soft film of moisture on the window panes, enough to make everything outside look like it was being seen through a veil of sorrow. Evelyn entered the hospital as usual, ash-gray cardigan draped over her white blouse. A thermos in one hand, her hair pulled back neatly. Jonas was home with Graham, but she still had her morning shift at the pediatric clinic, coordinating, mentoring new nurses. She expected nothing unusual, but the look she received from a young nurse as she walked in made her pause mid-step. "Evelyn, did you see the news this morning?" Evelyn looked up. "What news?" "Front page, about CEO Graham Wolfe, and you." She didn't ask for more. She walked quickly to her office, set down her bag, opened her phone. The headline hit her like a slap. The mysterious woman beside CEO Graham Wolfe, a surrogate mother. Raising the Wolfe heir. Below it, a photo. Blurry, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. She was holding Jonas, stepping out from the backyard, his arms wrapped around her neck, his head resting on her shoulder. Like always, no quotes from her. No confirmations, just lines like sources. Say, believed to be a former ICU nurse, Graham reportedly keeps her identity private for personal reasons. She read every word, but it felt like someone was peeling away the layers she had spent years building. Slowly, cruelly. Nothing written was entirely false, but not one word rang true. She had never called herself a surrogate mother, had never claimed a title. She was simply there because a child needed holding and a man needed to relearn how to live near his son. And now, all of it reduced to a headline, packaged into 2 words. The replacement. Graham hadn't called, hadn't texted, maybe he hadn't seen it, or maybe he had, and didn't yet know what to say. Evelyn didn't cry, but her eyes felt strange, dry in a way that wasn't numbness, just the absence of tears for a wound that didn't bleed. At lunch, she stood up, left the office. No word to the head nurse. No message. Didn't even grab her coat, just picked up her bag and walked out. She walked all the way home, a long route beneath rows of leafless trees. Traffic hummed. People passed, but each step felt like it pressed against something fragile inside her, something that cracked without sound. She had once accepted life without a name, but she hadn't imagined the day she'd be called one she never asked for. Back at her small apartment, she sat down on the floor, set her bag aside, leaned her head back against the wall. A breeze slipped through the open window. The curtain lifted slightly, then fell, like something had touched her, then withdrawn. She closed her eyes. Didn't think. Didn't wish. Only, for the first time in months, she felt herself being redefined. Not by love, but by the way the world decided to look at her. Some things don't need to be said out loud, but the way they name you, the way they write you, it can fold. Your heart like paper being crushed in someone else's hand. The small apartment sat on a quiet street near the hospital. White walls, gray curtains, a wooden window cracked open, and a glass jar holding a few dried lavender stalks, now browned with time. Evelyn came home on a damp afternoon. Not rainy, not cold, just that kind of unsettled air that makes you wonder whether to stay or leave. She opened the door, stepped in, took off her shoes, hung her bag on the wooden hook by the entrance. She didn't turn on the lights. Everything in the apartment was just as it had been, as though time had forgotten this room while she'd been busy living beside Jonas. She walked slowly down the hallway, her hand brushing the wall, tracing familiar places she used to steady herself, an old habit of someone who'd lived alone for too long. In the small bedroom she rarely entered, there was a drawer at the bottom of a chest, tied shut with a ribbon. No one had told her not to open it. No one had asked her to keep it hidden, but for nearly 2 years she had never once pulled it open. That afternoon she did, not out of curiosity, not in anger, but because some griefs lie buried so long that one day you have to touch them, just to be sure your heart is still there. The pale beige newborn shirt was still folded neatly, soft as ever, beside a pair of tiny socks and a half-finished baby cap. Evelyn sank to the floor, spread the shirt in front of her, fingers tracing the uneven stitches, stitched by her own hand on a quiet afternoon before she ever knew how fast happiness could collapse. She reached for the scissors in the desk, drawer, small, sharp, the plastic handle faded. No trembling, no hesitation, just one long breath before the blade met the fabric. That morning's headline had called her a surrogate mother. They knew nothing. Not about the child she never got to hold, not about the night Evelyn lay curled around her own belly, convinced her heart had stopped beating. Not about the way Jonas had looked at her the first time he lifted his face to hers, with eyes no child should have, deep and still and so quietly desperate it made you want to trade your whole future just to keep him safe. They didn't know, but they wrote, as if this was all a role. She placed the scissors against the shirt, thought it would take just one cut. To sever. To erase. To let go of a name she had never dared to claim. But then, 3 knocks. Soft, unhurried, just enough to stop the scissors mid-air. She didn't ask who. She wasn't expecting anyone. But her heart knew before her mind did. 3 more knocks. She stood, scissors still in hand, walked down the hall to the door, as though someone had gently taken her by the wrist and led her. She opened it. Jonas stood there, his arms around his old teddy bear. His eyes red, like he'd been crying. Beside him was Graham, silent, no apology in his eyes, just a waiting stillness. Jonas didn't smile, didn't speak. He just stepped forward and held out the bear to her, a gesture no one had taught him, but somehow exactly what she needed. Evelyn knelt, accepted the bear, felt his small arms wrap around her leg like roots searching for soil. She pulled him into her arms. The scissors slipped from her fingers, landed softly on the floor. No one noticed. Graham didn't step inside. He remained at the threshold. Evelyn didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Because when a child finds his way back, adults don't need proof to believe they are still where they belong. Graham didn't know how long he'd been standing at the threshold of that small apartment. The first winter breeze slipped through the hallway, nudging the hem of his shirt gently to one side, but he had no intention of leaving. In that moment, the man who once helmed a tech empire, signed multi-million-dollar deals, could only feel how empty his hands were, because everything worth holding was behind the door that had just opened. Evelyn had carried Jonas inside, and he hadn't followed. He didn't want to intrude on the hush that had settled there, but just as he turned to go, his eyes caught something on the table, a slip of yellowing paper lying beside a newborn shirt, still intact, not folded neatly, not tucked away, just there, caught in the stillness of an overcast afternoon, as if someone had taken it out and hadn't yet found the strength to put it back. He wasn't trying to pry, but his feet moved toward it on their own. No envelope, no sender, no recipient, just handwriting, slanted, careful, penned in faded blue ink. At the top of the page, a single line. To my child, if one day I have the courage to say your name again. Graham didn't read further. He didn't need to. That one line alone closed his throat. When he stepped inside with the letter in hand, Evelyn was still standing beside the bassinet under the window. Jonas had fallen asleep, his head tilted, a small hand curled around her finger like it had never let go. Evelyn looked up when she saw him. No alarm, no defense, just the kind of weariness that comes after a long day of holding yourself together. And in that weariness, she waited for him to speak. He didn't. He walked slowly to her, held the letter out. No pressure, no questions. Just returning a piece of the past, found at the wrong time, but no longer something that needed hiding. Her eyes darkened when she saw it, not with shame, but surprise. She took it, her hands trembling slightly like someone had placed into them a relic she'd once buried deep enough to forget it still existed. He sat down, not a meter from her. No rush, no probing, just presence. I wrote it a week after I left the hospital, she said quietly, evenly. Not sad, but each word felt like it had to walk across glass. At the time, I had no one to talk to, no one to hold me in place. I didn't think I'd survive, but I wasn't brave enough to die either. I wrote it because I was scared that if I didn't say anything, my child would think I'd forgotten them. Graham nodded, said nothing. I wrote it like I was talking to a baby still in my arms. I told them it had rained that day. I said I'd already picked a name. I apologized for working too much, for not listening to the doctor when she told me to rest, for believing I was stronger than my own body. She paused, didn't look at him, didn't look at the letter, just stared into the space between them, the space where griefs cross paths and recognize one another. I folded it. I couldn't send it. I couldn't burn it. I couldn't leave it out. So I tucked it under the newborn shirt. I told myself, if one day I'm strong enough to say my child's name again, I'll read it. But for almost 2 years, I never was. Graham leaned back in the chair. He never took his eyes off her, and in them, there was a kind of stillness. Not cold, but deep. The kind that comes when someone finally hears something they're not meant to fix. There were times I thought about throwing it away, Evelyn said, slower now. But I couldn't let go. It felt like if I did, then everything would truly be gone. And I hadn't even said I'm sorry yet. Jonas stirred in his sleep, let out a small breath, then nestled his head deeper into the pillow. The light outside was fading, drawing a soft chill across the room. Evelyn still held the letter, didn't open it, didn't fold it back, just held it tighter, like someone finally ready to claim what no longer needed hiding. Graham didn't ask anything more, because he knew some truths, once spoken, don't need answers. They just need to be heard by someone who listens with their whole heart. That afternoon, no one cried, but the silence between them was enough to say, people can love one another deeply, without ever needing to explain why. That night, the city breathed softly. The last winds of autumn no longer howled against the windows but brushed past like a quiet reminder. The season was changing. In Evelyn's small apartment, the kitchen light still glowed faintly, casting tilted streaks of amber across the white wall. She sat alone on a low wooden chair, the old letter in her hands, the one Graham had placed there hours earlier with a silence that said everything. For the first time in nearly 2 years, she unfolded it. Not quickly, not cleanly. Each line emerged. Under the light, blue ink slightly smudged, but every word still intact. The first sentence, written slowly as if afraid the wind might blur it, read, "To my child, if one day I have the courage to say your name again." She read each word like someone relearning the sound of their own voice. The letter held no surprises. It was the rainy day she came home alone, the unused baby pillow, the cry she never heard, the scar that still ached with every shift in weather, the apologies that spilled across paragraphs, and a final line that stayed with her the longest. If there is a next life, don't choose a mother who hasn't yet learned how to love herself. She folded it, didn't cry, but her chest clenched in that particular way grief sometimes does, not pain exactly, but a slow, cold press, as if a healed wound had been touched by name and started to bleed again. She stood up, pulled on a light coat, no makeup, no bag, only a small cloth in hand, Jonas's cloth from the first time he fed and fell asleep curled up in her arms. It was late, but the streets still glowed. She hailed a taxi to Graham's house, without texting, without asking. Graham wasn't. Surprised when he opened the door, he saw her, with a look that needed no words but made him open the door more gently than usual. Jonas was already asleep, but she asked to come in. The nursery hadn't changed. Warm, faintly scented with baby powder, bathed in the soft orange light of the night lamp, like a lantern lit for no one in particular. Jonas lay nestled in the soft fabric cradle, arms wrapped around his old bear, soft curls falling over his forehead. Evelyn walked to him. Didn't call, just sat by the cradle, quietly. She reached out, resting her hand gently on his chest, feeling the tiny lungs rise and fall. His eyelids twitched, once then stilled. She exhaled, slowly, then leaned in, her lips brushing the crown of his head, where it was thinnest, softest, closest to the heart. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not certain if she had said it aloud. "Not for you, but for the years I kept my heart locked." Outside, the wind stirred. The curtain shifted, like an old soul sighing. "Jonas," she murmured, still watching him. "There was once a child who never got held this long, who once kicked inside me, and then never made a sound." A long moment passed. "I used to think loving you meant betraying that child, but that's not true, because your little heart did nothing wrong. Neither did his." For the first time, a tear slipped from her eye. Just one. Not choked, not broken. Only quiet. Graham stood at the door. He heard everything, but he didn't come in. He knew. In that moment, Evelyn was standing between two worlds. One where she touched, a child still breathing, and one where she forgave the one she'd lost, with a love no longer tangled in guilt. She sat beside Jonas for a while longer. He didn't stir, didn't know, but Evelyn knew. Something had just been placed between them, not as a weight but as a new kind of embrace. She stood, took nothing with her, only folded the cloth and set it gently beside his pillow, a promise spoken without sound. At the door, Graham looked at her. His eyes asked, "Are you all right?" Evelyn smiled. Small, so small, and said only, for the first time, "I've forgiven." The little house on the quiet street still held the warmth of a sunlit morning. Jonas was playing on the floor, surrounded by wooden blocks, a few worn board books, and bits of Graham's old keepsakes, things he'd stored in the wooden chest, tucked in the corner, the one Evelyn had never opened. She knew it was where he kept memories of Lila. Graham had left early for a meeting. Evelyn stayed home with Jonas. She rolled out the rug, gathered the toys, made a bottle. Everything as usual. But something in her breath was lighter today, as if after last night, after whispering forgiveness beside a sleeping child, the ache inside her had begun to melt, like frost beneath the first warm light. Jonas crawled toward the chest. No one stopped him. He lifted the lid, unlatched, just resting there. Inside were soft things: a knitted scarf, a stack of old birthday cards, a leather-bound journal with a worn spine, and a small wooden box resting slightly askew among the memories. Jonas didn't know these things had once belonged to his mother. He only saw the box, just the right size for his hand. He opened it. Inside, beneath a patch of sunlight, lay a silver ring, simple, slender, engraved on the inside. He picked it up, toddled over to Evelyn. She was sitting, stacking books. When she looked up, there he was, his tiny hand outstretched, offering her the ring, its shine startlingly pure between fingers still sticky with cookie crumbs. Evelyn blinked. Surprised, she took it. Gently. It was Lila's wedding ring, one she'd seen in photographs but never imagined holding. Jonas looked at her with wide, clear eyes and said the one word he'd just recently learned. Give. Evelyn laughed. Not a loud laugh, but one that broke from a chest long held too tightly. It cracked into tears, too, as if someone had thrown open the curtains over an old memory and let the light in without asking for permission. She wiped her eyes, still laughing, still crying, then leaned forward, wrapped Jonas in her arms, and whispered, "Did you just propose to me, little man?" Jonas didn't understand, but he laughed anyway, pure and bright, because joy never asks why. Evelyn held his hand in hers, then gently placed the ring back into his palm, saying softly, "I'll keep the promise, but I won't keep someone else's place." Graham returned just then. He paused at the doorway, taking in the scene. Evelyn cradling Jonas, the ring in his small hand, and her eyes rimmed red but glowing, like someone who had just received a gift they never thought they could wish for. He stepped inside, quiet. Evelyn looked up. Their eyes met. No embarrassment, no need for words. Just, at last, her not turning away from what she truly felt. Graham sat down beside them, glancing at the ring, then at Jonas. Lila held it until the day Jonas was born, he said softly. I thought I'd keep it forever, but maybe he already knows who should hold it next. Evelyn shook her head gently and looked at Jonas. I don't need to keep anything, she said. Just let me keep the way he looks at me right now. That's enough. No one said anything more. But in the sunlight pouring through the window was a warmth that had nothing to do with things or titles. It came from a tiny hand that had, unknowingly, placed a ring in the lap of a woman once broken. Not to wed, but to stitch closed something she never believed could heal. Maybe a ring isn't always for promises. Sometimes it's just the way a small heart places into your hand the truth grown-ups are too afraid to speak, I've chosen you. Please don't leave. And if you've ever been chosen, even once, by a look so innocent, a gesture so uncalculated, then maybe you understand why Evelyn laughed. And if that makes you smile, then stay. There's more to tell. The story is long, but the heart, it's still here. That morning, Evelyn's kitchen was scented with toasted bread and the bright peel of a freshly opened orange. Jonas sat in his high chair, fingers playing with a soft piece of bread as he watched her pour water into a small glass carafe at the center of the table. Graham had left early without a note, but he didn't need to leave one. What needed to be understood had long since been spoken in the quiet between their glances. She cleared the breakfast dishes, slipped on a light coat, set Jonas down on the rug with his wooden blocks, and stepped into the small room she now called her study, a space that had once only held books and a computer, now made a little more her own. There was a wooden mailbox-shaped box, a few fountain pens, and a neat stack of cream-colored paper on the shelf. Evelyn pulled out a sheet. Not a letter to anyone. Not meant to be sent. Just today, she wanted to write to herself. She sat down. The morning light slanted across her shoulder, laying soft gold across the desk like a freshly pressed cloth. The pen she chose was the same one she had last used at the hospital. The first strokes were still uneven, but her hand no longer trembled. Her first line came slowly. To you, who once believed you were no longer enough to be a mother. No tears followed, but something cinched lightly in her chest. Not pain, just the ache of finally touching what she had long been too afraid to hold. She wrote about herself, to herself, about the days she couldn't bear to look in the mirror, afraid she'd see her child in her own face. About the nights she lay on her side, hand resting on a belly that held nothing anymore. About walking past the neonatal unit and having to hold her breath, as if even inhaling might shatter her from the inside out. She wrote slowly, deliberately, and then came the sentence where her hand stilled, where it all had been leading. I forgive you for surviving. She didn't write for being strong. She didn't write for not giving up. Only for surviving. As if, among all the words that could be named, surviving was the one most deserving of an embrace. She folded the letter. Not into an envelope. Not hidden away. Just placed it beside the window, where the sunlight spilled in every morning. So that if, one day, she forgot she had been forgiven, all she'd need to do was open the window and read. When she returned to the living room, Jonas had fallen asleep on the rug. He curled around his teddy bear, breathing evenly, legs tucked beneath him like a cocoon he'd spun all on his own. Evelyn sat beside him. No need to hold him. No need to wake him. She simply placed a hand over her own chest, where a heart was learning, slowly, how to beat again without bracing for pain. She thought, maybe she'd never forgotten how to love. Maybe she'd just forgotten the way back to her own heart. And now, in a morning so quiet, with a sleeping child beside her, a letter sunning itself on the windowsill, and a woman smiling for no reason. Anyone needed to explain. This, she realized, was springtime for those who have survived. That morning, Graham didn't go to the office. Jonas woke early, eyes still wrapped in sleep. Evelyn made tea instead of coffee, and the kitchen stayed quiet. No grinder humming, no rush. No one said the day was special, but the gentleness in the stillness whispered it in its own quiet way. Evelyn tied her hair up, slipped on a cream cardigan, and walked barefoot across the soft rug. Jonas sat on the floor, toy shovel in hand, scraping lightly at his father's pant leg. A gentle reminder of yesterday's promise. "Let's go plant trees, Dad." Graham smiled and nodded. He looked to Evelyn. She didn't ask, didn't object. She simply stepped closer, resting a hand on her son's shoulder. And together, the three of them walked into the backyard, where a small patch of earth had already been turned over last weekend. The soil was dark and damp, smelling of grass and sun, just enough golden light to feel warm without heat. A small apple tree stood waiting beside the plot. Graham had chosen it because Lila had loved apples ripening in late autumn. And Evelyn, she once said any tree that could survive the winter and still bloom deserved to be called a friend. Jonas stood in the center, arms wrapped around the sapling that barely reached his shoulders. Evelyn held the large spade. Graham shoveled the earth. They didn't speak much. No speeches, no photos. Just three people. One who had lost a wife, one who had lost a child, and one who had just learned to speak, gathering soil around a fragile, new life. The tender roots were laid down. The earth returned. Evelyn's hand pressed the final layer, softly, deliberately. Jonas watched. Then, suddenly, he bent down, scooped up a clumsy handful of dirt, and patted it over the roots. Messy, but full of intent. Someone laughed. Maybe Graham. Maybe Evelyn. But not loud. It was the kind of laugh that slips out when something gentle finally lands in the heart, like a seed. When the tree stood tall and steady, Evelyn sat beside Jonas. He turned toward her, head tilted, like he was deciding whether to say something. Graham stood behind them, wiping his hands on a cloth. Jonas touched the base of the tree, then looked back at Evelyn, and then, in a voice soft as breath, but clear and deliberate, he said, "Ma, ma." The wind stilled. The tree stilled. Graham froze. Evelyn's eyes widened. Jonas said it again. "Ma, ma." No one had taught him. No one had rehearsed this. Maybe he'd heard the word somewhere. Maybe he didn't understand its weight. But in that moment, among sun, soil, and three hands pressed to the earth, that sacred word wasn't learned. It was chosen. Evelyn began to cry. Not loud, not broken, but wholly, openly, tears that came from the place where a long-mended heart begins. Finally, to unravel the stitches not out of pain, but release. Graham stepped forward. He didn't hold her. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder. No one corrected Jonas. No one told him he was wrong, because some names don't come from blood. They rise from the only place we've never been taught, to lie. The heart. Evelyn pulled Jonas into her arms. She didn't say, "That's not my name." She didn't whisper, "I'm not your mother," because she knew, in that moment he wasn't naming a role. He was naming a feeling, the place he belonged. Some trees don't grow from perfect soil. They grow because someone trembling dared to plant hope again. And some words don't have to match a title. They only have to find the right person. Spring doesn't follow a calendar. It arrives in the instant someone calls you by the name only their heart could give. Evelyn sat still for a long time after Jonas spoke those two soft syllables. Ma, ma. Not loud, not clear, but enough to send a ripple through her, like someone had dropped a small stone onto a lake she thought had frozen over for 2 entire seasons. Graham said nothing. He simply sat beside her, his gaze resting on the young apple tree they had just planted, where the soil still clung damp to Jonas's hands, and a single root had been tucked beneath the earth by all three of them. A breeze passed through. The tender leaves rustled like blessings whispered by something ancient and unseen. Evelyn bent down and cradled Jonas. He tucked his head into the crook of her neck, silent in the way children are when they feel completely safe. But this time, it was different. Not the sleepiness after lunch. It was a letting go, gentle and full, like someone who knows finally they are exactly where they're meant to be. She pressed her face into the soft curls on his head. Her breath trembled, like someone learning at last how to speak in an old room that once scared them quiet. She used to be terrified of this. Terrified beyond reason, not because she didn't want to be loved like a mother, but because she'd once lost that chance. Suddenly, unfairly, and since that day, in her mind, motherhood belonged only to those bound by blood. For her to reach toward it again felt like betrayal. But now, this child, who knew nothing of her past, who didn't know who she had lost or what she had buried, was the first to call her by a sound. Not taught, not assigned, not prompted, just because he wanted to. No need for a name. Just the right person. Graham watched them. He didn't interrupt. He didn't move closer. He knew some moments are not for reaching, only for witnessing. When Evelyn finally lifted her head, her eyes held no fear. Not surprise. Not joy. But the gaze of someone who had finally unclenched her fingers from the edge of a cliff she'd been holding for too long. She laid Jonas down gently. He was already drifting off. His back rose and fell in quiet rhythm. His hand still clutched, in a fold of her shirt, instinctively. Evelyn stood, faced Graham. "I don't need him to call me anything," she said softly. "Just for him to know, whenever he needs to come back, I'll be here." Graham nodded. No words. But in his eyes was a silent recognition, the kind that comes from someone who had also once lost, who had once feared holding on, and now watched another dare to embrace what they themselves had let go. All that afternoon, Evelyn sat beside Jonas beneath the apple tree. Not to guard him, but as if to make a quiet pact with the earth. From now on, with each spring that returns, this place will remind them that not everything has to be born from blood to grow in real love. And some names, never spoken aloud, can still live a lifetime in a single look. Maybe what we truly need isn't to be defined by our role, but to be chosen by someone who doesn't know what to call us, only that we are where they feel most at home. The last morning of spring draped the sky in a soft, pale light, neither too bright nor too cold. Around the small house on the southern edge of the city, white daisies bloomed in gentle clusters, as if even the earth knew this day ought to be quieter, more tender than most. Jonas ran beneath the sun, a green paper airplane clutched in his hand, folded quickly by Graham after breakfast. His laughter drifted into the breeze, not loud, but clear and sure. Evelyn sat on the long wooden bench beneath the young apple tree they had planted a month ago. A new branch had stretched out since then. Fresh leaves quivered with the rhythm of the wind. Graham came out with 2 cups of tea, setting one beside her. "I still don't know what kind of flower this tea is," he said, "but you drink it every morning, so I figured today should be no different." Evelyn smiled. No need for thanks. She lifted the cup and took a sip. The warmth touched her lips and slid down her throat like a soft gesture from life itself. Jonas tumbled onto the grass, then sprang up again, chasing the shadow of himself stretching across the ground. It wasn't sharp or full, but it was enough to show him that he was, slowly, becoming someone. Graham sat beside Evelyn, his hand near hers, close but not quite touching. "I used to think," he said, "that if you lose someone, you'll never really feel whole again." "I used to think that too," Evelyn answered. "But maybe wholeness isn't the absence of loss. Maybe it's having room to love someone new, even after." Graham turned toward her. She didn't look at him. She was watching Jonas. The way her eyes followed him like sunlight that could run, that could laugh. "Graham." "Yeah?" "We're a family," she said, not pausing, not trembling, not unsure, even without blood, even without titles, even without any paper saying so. He nodded. "I know." Jonas came running back, then dropped into Evelyn's lap, forehead damp, cheeks flushed. He mumbled something sleepy and tucked his head against her chest, the way children do when play has filled them to the brim, and now they need warmth again. Evelyn wrapped her arms around him. Her hand moved gently along his back, slow, soothing circles as if she were lulling a part of her own heart to rest. Graham reached out and shielded them from the sun with his hand. The three of them sat beneath the apple tree. No more words. Just watching Jonas slip towards sleep, watching the new leaves ripple softly, watching a sky that held not a single cloud. No one mentioned tomorrow, but in each heart it was understood. From now on, every tomorrow is something they get to live. Not out of duty, but because they are finally allowed to. Evelyn rested her chin on Jonas's head and whispered as if to herself, "Tomorrow, we live. Thank you for staying with this story, for walking through grief, for moving through loneliness, and arriving at the quiet light of healing. The story doesn't speak for anyone. But if, even for a moment, you saw yourself in Evelyn's gaze, in Jonas's arms, or in Graham's silence, then perhaps you too are a survivor, and you too deserve a spring. Let stories like this linger inside you, and if you want to hear more, you know where to find them. Click subscribe so you won't miss the next one that reaches into the quietest part of your heart. Because maybe the next story is exactly what your heart has been waiting to hear. Thank you for walking this journey with us.